Hello and welcome back to TVP World. My name is Alex Simlinski and you're watching World Talks. Now, as Ukraine reels from another wave of brutal attacks on its capital, Western responses seem fragmented and a bit underwhelming. While Belgium has pledged some aid, the broader European response remains cautious. Meanwhile, regional tensions rise with massive Polish-Baltic military drills as an answer to the Russian-Belarusian war games. Joining us here on TVP World this morning is Andreas Upland from the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies to talk about these issues in greater detail. Good morning and welcome to TVP World. Great to have you on.
Good morning. Thanks for having me again.
So now, what is your assessment of the EU's, current posture towards Ukraine, given that the last 2 days we've had these meetings in Copenhagen?
Yes, the situation is complicated because the European Union is not made for this peculiar situation and cannot make the kind of swift decisions that are now needed. Many of its decisions are still made by consensus, have to be made by consensus. And one wonders actually whether the European Union is now the right structure for this or the right international organization to deal with that. Certainly, Ukraine is a candidate to become a member of the European Union, but and the European Union as a supranational organization with its organs in Brussels has been very pro-Ukrainian. But because it is a multi-country organization and has different countries among its members, it's been ineffective in a number of ways and has been imposing these sanctions packages. But usually the sanctions contain loopholes and inconsistencies that then allow Russia to continue a large part of its trade under less, perhaps, favorable conditions, but still, so far, the Russian economy is working. So we are here now in a situation where perhaps one should actually not focus that much on the European Union anymore, but rather on those countries that are willing to do more and that may also include countries that are not in the European Union. Most of all, of course, other European countries like Britain or Norway, but also perhaps non-European countries.
I'm going to ask you about non-European countries in a second. I want to stay on the topic of the European Union. Based on what you said, and I want to now give you a quote by the Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, who has said that Belgium has consistently declared its willingness to release the frozen Russian assets, provided we demonstrate practical solidarity with it in the event of Russian lawsuits. So coming back to what you just said, again, how much of an issue will it be to get the EU, to be on this matter on the same page at the same time? And do you think we'll see some kind of movement here with the use of these Russian foreign assets that are in Belgium?
Yes, this is one of these sad stories already for 3.5 years. There has been talk about not just freezing this money, but confiscating it since the very beginning of the war and of the large-scale war, and this has not yet happened. And so I'm skeptical that it will happen now. Friedrich Merz has also come, the German Chancellor has come out as being against it. And there are calculations here, perhaps, to also use this money in this frozen state in order to have something with which to deter a Russian attack on an EU member country and then threaten with confiscation. There's then a separate discussion about how much that confiscation would damage Europe as a sort of financial center of the world. But the length of this discussion that we already now have about this issue makes me skeptical that it's ever going to be resolved. Although, on the other hand, I also think that Russia is not going to get this money back.
Now, coming back to what you said, potentially on focusing on countries who are not in the EU. Recently, President Zelensky, I believe it was last week, he also said that he made an appeal to countries of the global south to also be involved in these peace talks and put some kind of pressure on Russia and Vladimir Putin. What do you think? I mean, first of all, why should these countries get on board, and what can they do in order to bring an end to Russia's war in Ukraine?
I think from a Ukrainian, I would say from an objective point of view, it makes sense to make such requests, because what is at stake in Ukraine is, of course, also indirectly the fate of many countries of the global south that are in perhaps similar situations, that do not have weapons of mass destructions, that may have neighbors which are looking at their territories, that are not members of an organization like NATO, and that should have an interest in upholding international law and the functioning of international solidarity and international organizations. These countries, one could argue, have actually more national interest in a resolution of the Russo-Ukrainian war, with in a just resolution, which would take into account Ukrainian interests, than, let's say, European countries that are members of the EU and NATO and thereby protected by these international organizations, whereas these countries of the global south do not have equivalent protection from international organizations. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, Russian and what could even say Soviet propaganda has been quite effective over decades in the global south, and there's a very skewed now view of this war among many countries of the global south. Although they are also, like Ukraine, former colonies, they had their own liberation wars, and they do not recognize this war that Ukraine is currently fighting as an anti-colonial, anti-imperial liberation war, but they see it as some sort of, I don't know, geopolitical conflict between the West and Russia, although now actually the American president looks like almost an ally of Putin. So hopefully at least some countries of the global south will hear Zelensky and will also get on board in supporting Ukraine and resolving the conflict in a just way.
Now, you mentioned Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He has recently said that in order to reopen the window of diplomacy, he also said that, well, words are not enough, and that sanctions, especially on the banking and energy sectors, are needed. So this brings me, to my question, just how probable will we see these sanctions, be placed on Russia? Do you think there's anything, well, maybe specific or anything more that has to happen? I mean, we've had Friday's attacks, we have Saturday's overnight attacks. I mean, what else has to happen in order for these to be put in place?
Yeah, I mean, these sanctions are certainly good and necessary, and they have already done their work partly, unfortunately only partly. And certainly the more the merrier, I would say, and the energy and banking sectors are here at the center, and perhaps this is going to be a part of the 19th EU sanctions package. But as we've seen, especially in the last weeks, the most effective sanction against Russia is giving Ukraine the ability to conduct long-range strikes on Russian infrastructure, on Russian industrial equipment, and to especially strike the energy sector. And this is actually now creating more and more economic problems, shortages of fuel in Russia. This is driving inflation. So in a way, this is the more effective economic measure to help Ukraine to develop its long-range strike capability, because with the sanctions, there are so many loopholes and alternatives to trade of Russia via Western routes, and there are so many opportunities for countries like China to help Russia that often these sanctions then do not have the necessary effect. Whereas the strikes on the various refineries and other infrastructure of the energy sector are now having an increasing effect.
And so, is there anything, more that, and now I'm going to ask, maybe let's have a look at the UK, which isn't in the EU anymore. Is there anything that maybe in particular this country can do to help in what you just said, to develop Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities?
Yeah, as far as I know, there is already something going on, and I don't know so much about what the UK is currently doing, but apparently Germany has, in the last months, tried to compensate Ukraine for the non-delivery of the Taurus cruise missiles with increased cooperation in development of the Ukrainian long-range capability within the Ukrainian military-industrial sector. So this is something that the Danish government has done first. It's also sometimes called the Denmark model, that you don't deliver weaponry to Ukraine, but rather you help Ukraine to build its own weapons. Often that is also more effective, quicker, and less costly if it's done within Ukraine by Ukrainian companies. So that is something that Britain could do. The other project I think that is still worth discussing is the no-fly zones over Ukraine. We've seen when Iran attacked Israel with a large array of drones and missiles, how effective Western help was then in protecting Israel from this large Iranian attack. And it's unclear why the West is not doing something similar with British fighter planes, German fighter planes, Polish fighter planes, other anti-aircraft weaponry to help Ukraine to protect at least its western part, and thereby to indirectly also support Ukraine in its war, because that would, of course, then free Ukrainian equipment and soldiers that could then be used for on the front line.
Now, one more thing I wanted to ask you. There has been an idea of post-war military training mission inside Ukraine. This idea has been floated around. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, these discussions about Western troops or trainers on Ukrainian ground is useful. The problem with all of that is that this is exactly what Russia does not want. It does not want to have Western troops on or training centers on Ukrainian ground, and the precondition for that to happen is that at least a stable ceasefire would be in place, because otherwise the countries that have proposed sending their trainers or troops to Russia would have problems, not to Ukraine, would have problems to justify that vis-a-vis their own parliaments and populations. So Russia will just then not let this situation happen. In other words, Russia will not implement a stable ceasefire, thereby preventing any such training centers in Ukraine. So this is now a sort of catch-22 situation, a strategic deadlock that we have. And it can only be resolved once Ukraine can have military victories on the battlefield, because then Russia would be forced into serious negotiations about a stable ceasefire, because it would then need the ceasefire itself. Currently, Russia does not need a ceasefire.
All right, of course, hoping that that ceasefire and peace does come to Ukraine as soon as possible. Andreas Upland from the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, thank you very much for being here with us on TVP World this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And with that, it's a wrap for this edition of World Talks. But as always, do stay tuned to TVP World for more interviews like this one, breaking news and updates. Thanks for watching.